You're looking at M113, a United States Army mechanized infantry vehicle that was created in 1962. In today's Learning Through History video, we're going to be learning about M113 and also how it influenced the world and how it changed a little bit of history. This is What the Math, and welcome. And once again, we're going to be using armored warfare to try to look at this tank and how it performs. And also we're going to be using a game called Wargame Red Dragon to try to simulate one of the historical missions. Now let's start with a bit of a description of what M113 is and what it isn't. Well, first of all, it's not really a tank. It was never meant to be a tank. It was meant to be one of the first lightweight vehicles that was light enough to be transported by airplane and could also be used in amphibious operations. It was also supposed to be able to transport personnel, and so basically the US was trying to create an all-purpose, all-terrain armored fighting vehicle. And before M113 became so popular in the US, there were actually quite a lot of previous designs. For example, M59 and also M75, but unfortunately both of those designs failed initial tests because one was too heavy and the other one was unfortunately a little bit too light armored, so it wasn't really protecting anyone. Now, this vehicle is mostly known for its participation during the Vietnam War, and this was actually the most used vehicle during the Vietnam War, and even had a kind of a nickname from the enemy, from the Viet Cong. They used to call it the Green Dragon because it was, scary and it was also green. And its main missions involved breaking through enemy strong points and basically defending and attacking enemy positions in the jungle and really anywhere else. This was also one of the first units, or one of the first vehicles to ever use aluminum armor. It actually made the vehicle much lighter, and even though it wasn't really as strong as some other tanks of that era, it provided just enough protection for M113 to be actually quite protected against small arms fire and most of the other attacks. And in later versions of this vehicle, additional armor was actually able to protect it even from some tank attacks. And even though this vehicle is actually over 50 years old now, it's even still used today in some of the American Army brigades. So this vehicle is still used today as an armored ambulance, also as a mortar carrier. It's often used as an engineering vehicle and also as a command vehicle as well. And because of its versatility, it actually has been used worldwide. So this is sort of like an equivalent of T-55, a Soviet tank, which is also very versatile. But in this case, it's actually a Western vehicle that was used by many Western countries. Approximately 80,000 of these units were produced and over 50 different countries used them, or still use them today. And since this vehicle was mainly used for transporting crew, it actually could carry up to 11 soldiers, and the gun that it had on top was just used as a support during the attack. And this gun was usually a machine gun, at least in the beginning. But this particular gun actually went through quite a lot of changes. First, it had no shield whatsoever, so a lot of the gunners ended up dying in the first few battles. Then they've started adding shields to protect the gunner, and then eventually this actually turned this vehicle into various versions, which you will see when I actually show you a game called Wargame, where you'll see various modifications of M113, including some with anti-tank gun. But nevertheless, the main mission for this vehicle was still transporting crew. And for its time, this was actually a very successful design. So not only could you place different weapons on it, it was also able to traverse water, so it was an amphibious vehicle. It was quite light to be placed in almost any transport aircraft, and you could actually land these or even throw them off the airplane with a parachute. And they were of course able to provide support for the infantry attack in certain positions, especially in the jungle, because for the jungle this was a perfect vehicle, which is why during the Vietnam War it was so actively used. But anyway, let's actually get back to M113 and talk a little bit more about how it influenced the world and how it actually influenced the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, the US was kind of forced to introduce these APC vehicles because it was very difficult for them to assault any jungle positions without any armor, and tanks weren't very good at it, and providing air support in the jungle was also very difficult. So they've created these mechanized divisions that actually just had M113s in them. And the first brigade that used them was actually an airborne brigade, so it was a brigade that was able to deploy quite quickly anywhere in Vietnam and then was able to go on an offensive relatively quickly as well. And most of the missions these vehicles participated in were usually search and destroy missions or some kind of fire-based security or even attack missions that would just use them as the main strike force. And most missions these vehicles participated in resulted in very few casualties for the United States and ended up causing quite a lot of casualties for the Vietnamese or North Vietnamese forces, also known as Viet Cong. But there were two missions where this vehicle played a very important role in, and that actually changed the way Vietnam War progressed. It actually destroyed the confidence for the South Vietnamese forces and really kind of put the United States in a very difficult situation where they had to decide whether to stay in Vietnam or leave. And these two missions were US invasion of Cambodia on 1st May of 1970, and then invasion of the Kingdom of Laos in 1971, specifically on February 8th of 1971. This was all during the Vietnam War, and it was actually meant to reinforce the border along the South Vietnam for the South Vietnamese forces, which were allied with the United States at that point, and was actually meant for them to kind of secure that border, because it was known that a lot of the North Vietnamese forces crossed the borders illegally into Laos and into Cambodia and actually were preparing to kind of attack from the side. And also they've created quite a lot of safe grounds in those areas, so the US was trying to eliminate the North Vietnamese forces in those regions and basically try to secure the ground for the South Vietnamese forces. Now, unfortunately, it's kind of hard to recreate all of this, so what I'm going to do is I'm basically using this game called Wargame Red Dragon, and we're going to put a few different versions of M113. Some of them have anti-tank weapons, some of them have more advanced TOW rockets that actually are meant to destroy tanks, some of them have mortars, and also some of them have just your typical machine gun. We're also going to add a few airplanes of that era because there was quite a lot of air support coming from the United States. But we're not going to add any tanks or anything else. However, we are going to be facing a much more superior in numbers force that are going to have their own APCs or transport vehicles, and because unfortunately I wasn't actually able to remove them from the game. And there's going to be a lot of infantry here. We're going to be fighting quite a lot of them. We're also going to have a few helicopters on our side just to kind of represent that, because helicopters and airplanes were widely used during the Vietnam War. And they will have no air force, they'll have nothing else, but they will have some anti-tank weapons and they'll have some anti-aircraft weapons as well. And so let's just see how this goes. We're going to launch a full-out assault on every position that they have and just try to use everything we have against them. Which is kind of what US did when they invaded both Cambodia and Laos using the combination of American, South Vietnamese, and also Khmer forces. So during the Cambodian campaign, the main objective was to try to defeat the 40,000 Viet Cong forces that were actually hiding somewhere in Cambodia, but unfortunately US didn't really know where. And Cambodia was completely neutral at this point. They were not really trying to support either side, but they were militarily really weak, so North Vietnam or Viet Cong was actually always invading their borders and always trying to use them as a hiding ground. Now, even though the operation in Laos was quite interesting and essentially showed the northern Vietnam that southern Vietnam was a force they could easily defeat, it was the operation in Cambodia that actually had a lot of ramifications on the history in the world. And what everything started with was, of course, the departure, or actually just the travel trip, of the leader of Cambodia by the name of Sihanouk. That's his picture right here. And so this guy was actually the prince of Cambodia at that point, and he went for a trip. And during that trip, US organized a coup d'etat where they've disposed of him and placed their own general, US, or not US general, but actually US friendly general by the name of Lon Nol. This is him right here. And so this guy became the new leader of Cambodia, and he was obviously allied with the Americans. And so with him in power, America was now able to bomb Cambodia without really causing any international conflict. But the Prince Sihanouk would not give up very easily. He actually went to Moscow and then Beijing to essentially ask for support of communist states, and actually promised quite a lot of promises, essentially establishing communist-friendly state if he was to regain his power. and then allied with North Vietnam. Because of this, he actually gained a lot of popularity with quite a lot of various extremist communist groups in Cambodia and in Laos, which would then lead him to become the leader of so-called Khmer Rouge. Now, because of this coup d'etat and because of the new US-friendly leadership, North Vietnamese essentially attacked Cambodia and provided a lot of weapons to Khmer Rouge and actually provided a lot of advisors and even military support, and this started a very, very big civil war in Cambodia. But the new leader, Long Nol, would not actually give up very easily either, and he would essentially unleash a reign of terror. He ordered murders of thousands of Vietnamese civilians, trying to prevent them from establishing a Vietnamese-friendly state. And because of his actions, both the North Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge decided they had to strike at the new general and essentially try to eliminate his government. A huge force from North Vietnam quickly overran large parts of Cambodia and were even able to reach the capital of Phnom Penh, or were at least within 20 kilometers of it. Every new territory they gained, they actually turned over to Khmer Rouge because they now officially had alliance with them. And so due to this, President Nixon, who was the president of the United States at that time, had to act quick. So he actually ordered a ground invasion using a lot of new vehicles, including M113. And even though at this point US was actually preparing to leave Vietnam, this is something that was called Vietnamization at that point, he still authorized this mission because it was important for them to establish security at least in one country. And this mission was actually officially planned by General Abrams, who has his name in the Abrams tank, of course. The Abrams tank is named after him. And because time was of the essence here, they had to work really quick and trying to use all of the information they had about the region to try to develop a strategy where they could actually easily invade Cambodia and eliminate the northern Vietnamese forces. And although most of the battles during this particular invasion were actually fought by the South Vietnamese forces, there was at least one battle that was fought entirely by the American troops. And this battle was on May 1st and near a town called Snaul. So this is when the 11th Armored Cavalry, supported by the helicopters, came under North Vietnamese fire as they were approaching the town and the airfield. And this is what I'm trying to recreate here. And as a result of this, Americans started a massive attack using air support and everything that they had essentially, including M113s. And blasted the town for 2 days, and there was absolutely nothing left at the end. Unfortunately, I didn't do that to this particular town that you see here. I guess there's several towns, but I got pretty close to that. But all of the other battles were actually fought mostly by the southern Vietnamese forces and had mostly air support from the Americans. And even though President Nixon actually proclaimed this to be the most successful military operation of the entire war, and in some sense, this was actually partially true because Cambodia became a safe ground during 1971 and 1972. But unfortunately, the Southern Vietnamese did not see it this way, and they actually knew that this was only a temporary disruption for the North Vietnamese and only gave them more reason to now dominate Laos, Cambodia, and Southern Vietnam as well. As a matter of fact, this actually gave them a reason to go back on the offensive, and despite previous ceasefire agreement, they actually ended up deciding on invading Southern Vietnam and taking it over completely. And of course, all of this culminated in the invasion of Southern Vietnam and then the capture of Saigon by the North Vietnamese army in April of 1975, which officially really marked the end of this particular war and the reunification of Northern and Southern Vietnam under the communist government. And because of this heated up civil war in Cambodia, Khmer Rouge was able to recruit quite a lot of members into their party and became so powerful that they then took over the power in the country and of course orchestrated the infamous Cambodian genocide. And there's quite a lot to say about the Khmer Rouge and about their rule between the 1975 and 1979, but it was really the so-called genocide that they're so infamous for, where over 2 million civilians were actually killed under the power of their leader Pol Pot. But of course, North Vietnam or China, who were actually training the Khmer Rouge, are not to blame for this, because back then they had no extremist views and they were just trying to liberate their own country. And it was much later when they actually came to power that they started these so-called social engineering policies where they essentially tried to have an agricultural reform on top of executions and torture that they actually were famous for. And ironically, the reason why Khmer Rouge actually was deposed later on was because Vietnam actually invaded them in 1979. Because at that point, Cambodia was becoming a little bit too pro-Chinese for the Vietnamese tastes, and the relations between Vietnam and China has deteriorated. And so the Vietnamese forces, which were initially helping the Khmer Rouge, actually deposed of the regime, creating a completely new socialist government that was supportive of Vietnam. And interestingly, at this point, Vietnam, Soviet Union, and Cambodia actually became close allies, while China actually was their enemy, which is related to what I talked about in one of the previous videos when I talked about the Sino-Soviet conflict, when Soviets had a small conflict with China that actually almost resulted in another world war. But I think we'll talk about all of these other conflicts in one of the future videos. Because from this video about M113, what you should have learned is that this was the main vehicle used during the Vietnam War. It was also the main vehicle used during the invasion of Cambodia, which changed its history and unfortunately resulted in Khmer Rouge coming to power, causing the genocide, and then being deposed by the Vietnamese yet again. And note that both Cambodia and Vietnam have much different governments today, with Cambodia actually becoming a monarchy yet again, having a king and a prince. And Vietnam, even though it was communist, having some really awesome economic and political reforms similar to China in a sense, where it has now become one of the world's fastest growing economies and has now even joined World Trade Organization. And anyway, I think that's it for M113 and how it changed the world. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, subscribe and watch out for more of these historical videos using video games. Also, don't forget to share this video with your friends and your teachers or your students. If you think I haven't mentioned something important about the tank or about the conflicts we talked about in this video, please post it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and game you later, guys. Bye bye.